Chapter 16. Quote, EDG. Before you fight the battle, ope this letter. Unquote. From Lear. Major Hayward found Monroe attended only by his daughters. Alice sat upon his knee, parting the gray hairs of the forehead of the old man with her delicate fingers, and whenever he affected to frown on her trifling, appeasing his assumed anger by pressing her ruby lips fondly on his wrinkled brow. Cora was seated nigh them, a calm and amused looker-on, regarding the wayward movements of her more youthful sister with that species of maternal fondness which characterized her love for Alice. Not only the dangers through which they had passed, but those which still impended above them, appeared to be momentarily forgotten in the soothing indulgence of such a family meeting. It seemed as if they had profited by the short truce to devote an instant to the purest and best affection, the daughters forgetting their fears, and the veteran his cares, in the security of the moment. Of this scene Duncan, who in his eagerness to report his arrival had entered unannounced, stood many moments an unobserved and a delighted spectator. But the quick and dancing eyes of Alice soon caught a glimpse of his figure, reflected from a glass, and she sprang blushing from her father's knee, exclaiming aloud, "Major Hayward!" "What of the lad?" demanded her father. "I have sent him to crack a little with the Frenchman." "Ah, sir, you are young and you are nimble. Away with ye baggage, as if there were not troubles enough for a soldier without having his camp filled with such prattling hussies as yourself." Alice laughingly followed her sister, who instantly led the way from an apartment where she perceived their presence was no longer desirable. Monroe, instead of demanding the result of the young man's mission, paced the room for a few moments with his hands behind his back, and his head inclined toward the floor, like a man lost in thought. At length he raised his eyes, glistening with a father's fondness, and exclaimed, "They are a pair of excellent girls, Hayward, and such as any one may boast of."
"You are not now to learn my opinion of your daughters, Colonel Monroe."
"True, lad, true," interrupted the impatient old man. "You were about opening your mind more fully on that matter the day you got in, but I did not think it becoming in an old soldier to be talking of nuptial blessings and wedding jokes, when the enemies of his king were likely to be unbidden guests at the feast. But I was wrong, Duncan, boy, I was wrong there, and I am now ready to hear what you have to say."
"Notwithstanding the pleasure your assurance gives me, dear sir, I have just now a message from Montcalm."
"Let the Frenchman and all his host go to the devil, sir," exclaimed the hasty veteran. "He is not yet master of William Henry, nor shall he ever be, provided Webb proves himself the man he should. No, sir, thank heaven we are not yet in such a strait that it can be said Monroe is too much pressed to discharge the little domestic duties of his own family. Your mother was the only child of my bosom friend, Duncan, and I'll just give you a hearing, though all the knights of St. Louis were in a body at the sally port, with the French saint at their head, crying to speak a word under favor. A pretty degree of knighthood, sir, is that which can be brought with sugar hogsheads. And then your twopenny marquisates. The thistle is the order for dignity and antiquity, the veritable nemo me impune lacet of chivalry. Ye had ancestors in that degree, Duncan, and they were an ornament to the nobles of Scotland." Hayward, who perceived that his superior took a malicious pleasure in exhibiting his contempt for the message of the French general, was fain to humor a spleen that he knew would be short-lived. He therefore replied with as much indifference as he could assume on such a subject.
"My request, as you know, sir, went so far as to presume the honor of being your son."
Ah, boy, you found words to make yourself very plainly comprehended. But let me ask ye, sir, have you been as intelligible to the girl?
Oh, my honor, no, exclaimed Duncan warmly. There would have been an abuse of a confided trust, had I taken advantage of my situation for such a purpose.
Your notions are those of a gentleman, Major Hayward, and well enough in their place. But Cora Munro is a maiden too discreet, and of a mind too elevated and improved, to need the guardianship even of a father.
Cora?
Ay, Cora. We are talking of your pretensions to Miss Munro, are we not, sir?
I was not conscious of having mentioned her name, said Duncan, stammering.
And to marry whom, then, did you wish my consent, Major Hayward? Demanded the old soldier, erecting himself in the dignity of offended feeling.
You have another, and not less lovely child.
Alice? Exclaimed the father, in an astonishment equal to that with which Duncan had just repeated the name of her sister.
Such was the direction of my wishes, sir.
The young man waited in silence, the result of the extraordinary effect produced by a communication, which as it now appeared was so unexpected. For several minutes Munro paced the chamber with long and rapid strides, his rigid features working convulsively, and every faculty seemingly absorbed in the musings of his own mind. At length he paused directly in front of Hayward, and riveting his eyes upon those of the other, he said, with a lip that quivered violently, "Duncan Hayward, I have loved you for the sake of him whose blood is in your veins. I have loved you for your own good qualities, and I have loved you because I thought you would contribute to the happiness of my child. But all this love would turn to hatred, were I assured that what I so much apprehend is true."
God forbid that any act or thought of mine should lead to such a change, exclaimed the young man, whose eye never quailed under the penetrating look it encountered. Without adverting to the impossibility of the other's comprehending those feelings which were hid in his own bosom, Munro suffered himself to be appeased by the unaltered countenance he met, and with a voice sensibly softened, he continued, "Ye would be my son, Duncan, and you're ignorant of the history of the man you wish to call your father? Sit ye down, young man, and I will open to you the wounds of a sacred heart, in as few words as may be suitable." By this time the message of Montcalm was as much forgotten by him who bore it as by the man for whose ears it was intended. Each drew a chair, and while the veteran communed a few moments with his own thoughts, apparently in sadness, the youth suppressed his impatience in a look and attitude of respectful attention. At length the former spoke. "You know already, Major Hayward, that my family was both ancient and honorable," commenced the Scotsman, "though it might not altogether be endowed with that amount of wealth that should correspond with its degree. I was, maybe, such an one as yourself, when I plighted my faith to Alice Graham, the only child of a neighboring laird of some estate. But the connection was disagreeable to her father on more accounts than my poverty. I did, therefore, what an honest man should, restored the maiden her troth, and departed the country in the service of my king. I had seen many regions, and had shed much blood in different lands, before duty called me to the islands of the West Indies. There it was my lot to form a connection with one who in time became my wife, and the mother of Cora. She was the daughter of a gentleman of those isles, by a lady whose misfortune it was, if you will," said the old man proudly, "to be descended remotely from that unfortunate class
who are so basely enslaved to administer to the wants of a luxurious people. Ay, sir, that is a curse entailed on Scotland by her unnatural union with a foreign and trading people. But could I find a man among them who would dare to reflect on my child, he should feel the weight of a father's anger. Ha, Major Hayward, you are yourself born at the South, where these unfortunate beings are considered of a race inferior to your own.
"'Tis most unfortunately true, sir,"
said Duncan, unable any longer to prevent his eyes from sinking to the floor in embarrassment.
And you cast it on my child as a reproach? You scorn to mingle the blood of the Haywards with one so degraded, lovely and virtuous though she be?
Fiercely demanded the jealous parent.
"Heaven protect me from a prejudice so unworthy of my reason,"
returned Duncan, at the same time conscious of such a feeling, and that as deeply rooted as if it had been engrafted in his nature.
"The sweetness, the beauty, the witchery of your younger daughter, Colonel Munro, might explain my motives, without imputing to me this injustice."
"Ye are right, sir,"
returned the old man, again changing his tones to those of gentleness, or rather softness.
"The girl is the image of what her mother was at her years, and before she had become acquainted with grief. When death deprived me of my wife, I returned to Scotland, enriched by the marriage. And would you think it, Duncan? The suffering angel had remained in the heartless state of celibacy 20 long years, and that for the sake of a man who could forget her. She did more, sir. She overlooked my want of faith, and all difficulties being now removed, she took me for her husband."
"And became the mother of Alice,"
exclaimed Duncan, with an eagerness that might have proved dangerous at a moment when the thoughts of Munro were less occupied than at present.
"She did indeed," said the old man, "and dearly did she pay for the blessing she bestowed. But she is a saint in heaven, sir, and it ill becomes one whose foot rests on the grave to mourn a lot so blessed. I had her but a single year, though, a short term of happiness for one who had seen her youth fade in hopeless pining."
There was something so commanding in the distress of the old man, that Hayward did not dare to venture a syllable of consolation. Munro sat utterly unconscious of the other's presence, his features exposed and working with the anguish of his regrets, while heavy tears fell from his eyes and rolled unheeded from his cheeks to the floor. At length he moved, and as if suddenly recovering his recollection, when he arose, and taking a single turn across the room, he approached his companion with an air of military grandeur, and demanded,
"Have ye not, Major Hayward, some communication that I should hear from the Marquis de Malcolm?"
Duncan started in his turn, and immediately commenced in an embarrassed voice the half-forgotten message. It is unnecessary to dwell upon the evasive though polite manner with which the French general had eluded every attempt of Hayward to worm from him the purport of the communication he had proposed making, or on the decided though still polished message by which he now gave his enemy to understand that unless he chose to receive it in person, he should not receive it at all. As Munro listened to the detail of Duncan, the excited feelings of the father gradually gave way before the obligations of his station, and when the other was done, he saw before him nothing but the veteran, swelling with the wounded feelings of a soldier.
"Ye have said enough, Major Hayward," exclaimed the angry old man, "enough to make a volume of commentary on French civility. Here has this gentleman invited me to a conference, and when I sent him a capable substitute, figure all that, Duncan, though your years be but few. He answers me with a riddle.
Ye may have thought less favorably of the substitute, my dear sir, and you will remember that the invitation, which he now repeats, was to the commandant of the works, and not to his second.
Well, sir, is not a substitute clothed with all the power and dignity of him who grants the commission? He wishes to confer with Munro? Faith, sir, I have much inclination to indulge the man, if it should only be to let him behold the firm countenance we maintain, in spite of his numbers and his summons. There might not be bad policy in such a stroke, young man.
Duncan, who believed it of the last importance that they should speedily come to the contents of the letter borne by the scout, gladly encouraged this idea.
Without a doubt, he could gather no confidence by witnessing our indifference, he said.
You never said a truer word. I could wish, sir, that he would visit the works in open day, and in the form of a storming party. That is the least failing method of proving the countenance of an enemy, and would be far preferable to the battering system he has chosen. The beauty and manliness of warfare has been much deformed, Major Hayward, by the arts of Monsieur Vauban. Our ancestors were far above such scientific cowardice.
It may be very true, sir, but we are now obliged to repel art by art. What is your pleasure in the matter of the interview?
I will meet the Frenchman, and that without fear or delay. Promptly, sir, as becomes a servant of my royal master. Go, Major Hayward, and give them a flourish of the music, and send out a messenger to let them know who is coming. We will follow with a small guard, for such respect is due to one who holds the honor of his king in keeping. And hark ye,
Duncan, he added in a half-whisper, though they were alone,
it may be prudent to have some aid at hand, in case there should be treachery at the bottom of it all.
The young man availed himself of this order to quit the apartment, and as the day was fast coming to a close, he hastened, without delay, to make the necessary arrangements. A very few minutes only were necessary to parade a few files, and to dispatch an orderly with a flag to announce the approach of the commandant of the fort. When Duncan had done both these things, he led the guard to the sally-port, near which he found his superior, ready, waiting his appearance. As soon as the usual ceremonials of a military departure were observed, the veteran and his more youthful companion left the fortress, attended by the escort. They had proceeded only a few hundred yards from the works, when the little array which attended the French general to the conference was seen issuing from a hollow way which formed the bed of a brook that ran between the batteries of the besiegers and the fort. From the moment that Munro left his own works to appear in front of his enemies, his air had been grand, and his step and countenance highly military. The instant he caught a glimpse of the white plume that waved in the hat of Montcalm, his eye lighted, and age no longer appeared to possess any influence over his vast and still muscular person.
Speak to the boys to be watchful, sir, he said in an undertone to Duncan, and to look well to their flints and steel, for one is never safe with a servant of these Louis. At the same time, we shall show them the front of men in deep security. You'll understand me, Major Hayward.
He was interrupted by the clamor of a drum from the approaching Frenchmen, which was immediately answered when each party pushed an orderly in advance, bearing a white flag, and the wary Scotsman halted with his guard close at his back. As soon as this slight salutation had passed, Montcalm moved toward them with a quick but graceful step, bearing his head to the veteran, and dropping his spotless plume neatly to the earth in courtesy. If the air of Munro was more commanding and manly, It wanted both the ease and insinuating polish of that of the Frenchman. Neither spoke for a few moments, each regarding the other with curious and interested eyes. Then, as became his superior rank and the nature of the interview, Montcalm broke the silence. After uttering the usual words of greeting, he turned to Duncan, and continued with a smile of recognition, speaking always in French. "I am rejoiced, monsieur, that you have given us the pleasure of your company on this occasion. There will be no necessity to employ an ordinary interpreter, for in your hands I feel the same security as if I spoke your language myself." Duncan acknowledged the compliment, when Montcalm, turning to his guard, which in imitation of that of their enemies pressed close upon him, continued, "Henri, mes enfants, il faut retirer vos en paix." Before Major Hayward could imitate this proof of confidence, he glanced his eyes around the plain, and beheld with uneasiness the numerous dusky groups of savages, who looked out from the margin of the surrounding woods, curious spectators of the interview.
"Monsieur de Montcalm will readily acknowledge the difference in our situation,"
he said with some embarrassment, pointing at the same time toward those dangerous foes, who were to be seen in almost every direction.
"Were we to dismiss our guard, we should stand here at the mercy of our enemies."
"Monsieur, you have the plighted faith of un gentilhomme français for your safety,"
returned Montcalm, laying his hand impressively on his heart.
"It should suffice."
"It shall fall back,"
Duncan added to the officer who led the escort.
"Fall back, sir, beyond hearing, and wait for orders."
Munro witnessed this movement with manifest uneasiness, nor did he fail to demand an instant explanation.
"Is it not our interest, sir, to betray distrust?"
retorted Duncan.
"Monsieur de Montcalm pledges his word for our safety, and I have ordered the men to withdraw a little, in order to prove how much we depend on his assurance."
"It may be all right, sir, but I have no overwhelming reliance on the faith of these Marquesas, or Marquises as they call themselves. Their patents of nobility are too common to be certain that they bear the seal of true honor."
"You forget, dear sir, that we confer with an officer, distinguished alike in Europe and America for his deeds. From a soldier of his reputation we can have nothing to apprehend."
The old man made a gesture of resignation, though his rigid features still betrayed his obstinate adherence to a distrust which he derived from a sort of hereditary contempt of his enemy, rather than from any present signs which might warrant so uncharitable a feeling. Montcalm waited patiently until this little dialogue in demi-voice was ended, when he drew nigher and opened the subject of their conference.
"I have solicited this interview from your superior, monsieur,"
he said,
"because I believe he will allow himself to be persuaded that he has already done everything which is necessary for the honor of his prince, and will now listen to the admonitions of humanity. I will forever bear testimony that his resistance has been gallant, and has continued as long as there was hope."
When this opening was translated to Munro, he answered with dignity, but with sufficient courtesy,
"However I may prize such testimony from Monsieur Montcalm, it will be more valuable when it shall be better merited."
The French general smiled as Duncan gave him the purport of his reply, and observed,
"What is so freely accorded to approved courage may be refused to useless obstinacy. Monsieur would wish to see my camp, and witness for himself our numbers, and the impossibility of his resisting them with success."
"I know that the King of France is well served,"
returned the unmoved Scotsman, as soon as Duncan ended his translation.
"but my own royal master has as many and as faithful troops."
"Though not at hand, fortunately for us,"
said Montcalm, without waiting, in his ardor, for the interpreter.
"There is destiny in war, to which a brave man knows how to submit with the same courage that he faces his foes." "Had I been conscious that Monsieur Montcalm was master of the English, I should have spared myself the trouble of so awkward a translation,"
said the vexed Duncan dryly, remembering instantly his recent byplay with Munro.
"Your pardon, Monsieur,"
rejoined the Frenchman, suffering a slight color to appear in his dark cheek.
"There is a vast difference between understanding and speaking a foreign tongue. You will, therefore, please to assist me still?"
Then, after a short pause, he added,
"These hills afford us every opportunity of reconnoitering your works, messieurs, and I am possibly as well acquainted with their weak condition as you can be yourselves."
"Ask the French general if he has glasses to reach the Hudson," said Munro proudly, "and if he knows when and where to expect the army of Webb."
"Let General Webb be his own interpreter,"
returned the politic Montcalm, suddenly extending an open letter toward Munro as he spoke.
"You will there learn, monsieur, that his movements are not likely to prove embarrassing to my army."
The veteran seized the offered paper, without waiting for Duncan to translate the speech, and with an eagerness that betrayed how important he deemed its contents. As his eyes passed hastily over the words, his countenance changed from its look of military pride to one of deep chagrin. His lip began to quiver, and suffering the paper to fall from his hand, his head dropped upon his chest, like that of a man whose hopes were withered in a single blow. Duncan caught the letter from the ground, and without apology for the liberty he took, he read at a glance its cruel purport. Their common superior, so far from encouraging them to resist, advised a speedy surrender, urging in the plainest language, as a reason, the utter impossibility of his sending a single man to their rescue.
"Here is no deception,"
exclaimed Duncan, examining the billet both inside and out.
"This is the signature of Webb, and must be the captured letter."
"The man has betrayed me,"
Munro at length bitterly exclaimed.
"He has brought dishonor to the door of one where disgrace has never before known to dwell, and shame has he reaped heavily on my gray hairs."
"Say not so," cried Duncan. "We are yet masters of the fort, and of our honor. Let us then sell our lives at such a rate as shall make our enemies believe the purchase too dear."
"Boy, I thank thee,"
exclaimed the old man, rousing himself from his stupor.
"You have for once reminded Munro of his duty. We will go back and dig our graves behind those ramparts."
"Messieurs,"
said Montcalm, advancing toward them a step, in generous interest,
"you little know Louis de Saint Véran if you believe him capable of profiting by this letter to humble brave men, or to build up a dishonest reputation for himself. Listen to my terms before you leave me." "What says the Frenchman?" demanded the veteran sternly. "Does he make a merit of having captured a scout with a note from headquarters? Sir, he had better raise this siege to go and sit before Edward, if he wishes to frighten his enemy with words."
Duncan explained the other's meaning.
"Monsieur Montcalm, we will hear you,"
the veteran added more calmly, as Duncan ended.
"To retain the fort is now impossible,"
said his liberal enemy.
"It is necessary, in the interest of my master, that it should be destroyed. But as for yourself and your brave comrades, there is no privilege dear to a soldier that shall be denied." "Our colors?"
demanded Heyward.
"Carry them to England, and show them to your king."
"Our arms?"
"Keep them. None can use them better."
"Our march? The surrender of the place?"
"Shall be done in a way most honorable to yourselves.
Duncan now turned to explain these proposals to his commander, who heard them with amazement, and a sensibility that was deeply touched by so unusual and unexpected generosity.
"Go, you Duncan," he said, "go with this Marquess, as indeed Marquess he should be. Go to his marquis and arrange it all. I have lived to see two things in my old age that never did I expect to behold: an Englishman afraid to support a friend, and a Frenchman too honest to profit by his advantage."
So saying, the veteran again dropped his head to his chest, and returned slowly toward the fort, exhibiting by the dejection of his air to the anxious garrison a harbinger of evil tidings. From the shock of this unexpected blow, the haughty feelings of Munro never recovered, but from that moment there commenced a change in his determined character, which accompanied him to a speedy grave. Duncan remained to settle the terms of the capitulation. He was seen to re-enter the works during the first watches of the night, and immediately after a private conference with the commandant, to leave them again. It was then openly announced that hostilities must cease, Munro having signed a treaty by which the place was to be yielded to the enemy with the morning, the garrison to retain their arms, the colors and their baggage, and consequently, according to military opinion, their honor. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17. Quote, "Weave the woof, the thread is spun, the web is wove, the work is done." Unquote. By Gray. The hostile armies, which lay in the wilds of the Horican, passed the night of the 9th of August, 1757, much in the manner they would had they encountered on the fairest field of Europe. While the conquered were still, sullen, and dejected, the victors triumphed. But there are limits alike to grief and joy, and long before the watches of the morning came, the stillness of those boundless woods was only broken by a gay call from some exulting young Frenchman of the advanced pickets, or a menacing challenge from the fort, which sternly forbade the approach of any hostile footsteps before the stipulated moment. Even these occasional threatening sounds ceased to be heard in that dull hour which precedes the day, at which period a listener might have sought in vain any evidence of the presence of those armed powers that then slumbered on the shores of the Holy Lake. It was during these moments of deep silence that the canvas which concealed the entrance to a spacious marquee in the French encampment was shoved aside, and a man issued from beneath the drapery into the open air. He was enveloped in a cloak which might have been intended as a protection from the chilling damps of the woods, but which served equally well as a mantle to conceal his person. He was permitted to pass the grenadier, who watched over the slumbers of the French commander, without interruption, the man making the usual salute which betokens military deference, as the other passed swiftly through the little city of tents, in the direction of William Henry. Whenever this unknown individual encountered one of the numberless sentinels who crossed his path, his answer was prompt, and, as it appeared, satisfactory, for he was uniformly allowed to proceed without further interrogation. With the exception of such repeated but brief interruptions, he had moved silently from the center of the camp to its most advanced outpost, when he drew nigh the soldier who held his watch nearest to the works of the enemy. As he approached, he was received with the usual challenge. "Que vive?" "Français," was the reply. "Le mot d'ordre." "Le victory," said the other, drawing so nigh as to be heard in a loud whisper. "C'est bien," returned the sentinel, throwing his musket from the charge to his shoulder. "Vous promenez bien mentit, monsieur." "Il est nécessaire d'être vigilant, mon enfant," the other observed, dropping a fold of his cloak, and looking the soldier close in the face as he passed him, still continuing his way toward the British fortification. The man started, his arms rattled heavily as he threw them forward in the lowest and most respectful salute, and when he had again recovered his peace, he turned to walk his post, muttering between his teeth, "Font très vigilant in vérité, je crois que nous avons là un corporal qui n'y doute jamais." The officer proceeded without affecting to hear the words which escaped the sentinel in his surprise, nor did he again pause until he had reached the low strand, and in a somewhat dangerous vicinity to the western water bastion of the fort. The light of an obscure moon was just sufficient to render objects, though dim, perceptible in their outlines. He therefore took the precaution to place himself against the trunk of a tree, where he leaned for many minutes, and seemed to contemplate the dark and silent mounds of the English works in profound attention. His gaze at the ramparts was not that of a curious or idle spectator, but his looks wandered from point to point, denoting his knowledge of military usages, and betraying that his search was not unaccompanied by distrust. At length he appeared satisfied, and having cast his eyes impatiently upward toward the summit of the eastern mountain, as if anticipating the approach of the morning, he was in the act of turning on his footsteps, when a light sound on the nearest angle of the bastion caught his ear, and induced him to remain. Just then a figure was seen to approach the edge of the rampart, where it stood, apparently contemplating in its turn the distant tents of the French encampment. Its head was then turned toward the east, as though equally anxious for the appearance of light, when the form leaned against the mound, and seemed to gaze upon the glassy expanse of the waters, which, like a submarine firmament, glittered with its thousand mimic stars. The melancholy air, the hour, together with the vast frame of the man who thus leaned, musing against the English ramparts, left no doubt as to his person in the mind of the observant spectator. Delicacy, no less than prudence, now urged him to retire, and he had moved cautiously round the body of the tree for that purpose, when another sound drew his attention, and once more arrested his footsteps. It was a low and almost inaudible movement of the water, and was succeeded by a grating of pebbles, one against the other. In a moment he saw a dark form rise, as it were, out of the lake, and steal without further noise to the land, within a few feet of the place where he himself stood. A rifle next slowly rose between his eyes and the watery mirror, but before it could be discharged, his own hand was on the lock. "Huh!" exclaimed the savage, whose treacherous aim was so singularly and unexpectedly interrupted. Without making any reply, the French officer laid his hand on the shoulder of the Indian, and led him in profound silence to a distance from the spot, where their subsequent dialogue might have proved dangerous, and where it seemed that one of them, at least, sought a victim. Then, throwing open his cloak, so as to expose his uniform and the cross of St. Louis, which was suspended at his breast, Montcalm sternly demanded, "What means this? Does my son not know that the hatchet is buried between the English and his Canadian father?" "What can the Hurons do?" returned the savage, speaking also, though imperfectly, in the French language. "Not a warrior has a scalp, and the pale faces make friends." "Ah, le renard subtil! Methinks this is an excess of zeal for a friend who was so late an enemy. How many suns have set since Le Renard struck the war-post of the English?" "Where is that sun?" demanded the sullen savage. "Behind the hill, and it is dark and cold, but when he comes again it will be bright and warm. Le Subtil is the son of his tribe. There have been clouds and many mountains between him and his nation, but now he shines, and it is a clear sky."
"The Renard has power with his people, I well know," said Montcalm, "for yesterday he hunted for their scalps, and to-day they hear him at the council fire."
Magua is a great chief.
"Let him prove it by teaching his nation how to conduct themselves toward our new friends."
Why did the chief of the Canadas bring this young man into the woods and fire his cannon at the earthen house?" demanded the subtle Indian.
"To subdue it. My master owns the land, and your father was ordered to drive off these English squatters. They have consented to go, and now he calls them enemies no longer."
"'Tis well Magua took the hatchet to color it with blood. It is now bright. When it is red, it shall be buried."
"But Magua is pledged not to sully the lilies of France. The enemies of the great king across the Salt Lake are his enemies. His friends, the friends of the Hurons."
"Friends?" repeated the Indian in scorn. "Let his father give Magua a hand."
Montcalm, who felt that his influence over the warlike tribes he had gathered was to be maintained by concession rather than by power, complied reluctantly with the other's request. The savage placed the fingers of the French commander on a deep scar in his bosom, and then exultingly demanded,
"Does my father know that?"
"What warrior does not? 'Tis where a leaden bullet has cut."
"And this?"
continued the Indian, who had turned his naked back to the other, his body being without its usual calico mantle.
"This, my son, has been sadly injured here. Who has done this?"
"Magua slept hard in the English wigwams, and the sticks have left their mark,"
returned the savage, with a hollow laugh, which did not conceal the fierce temper which nearly choked him. Then, recollecting himself, with a sullen and native dignity, he added,
"Go teach your young man at his peace. Le Renard Subtil knows how to speak to a Huron warrior."
Without deigning to bestow further words, or to wait for any answer, the savage cast his rifle into the hollow of his arm, and moved silently through the encampment toward the woods where his own tribe was known to lie. Every few yards as he proceeded, he was challenged by the sentinels, but he stalked sullenly onward, utterly disregarding the summons of the soldiers, who only spared his life because they knew the air and tread no less than the obstinate daring of an Indian. Montcalm lingered long and melancholy on the stand where he had been left by his companion, brooding deeply on the temper which his ungovernable ally had just discovered. Already had his fair fame been tarnished by one horrid scene, and in circumstances fearfully resembling those under which he now found himself. As he mused, he became keenly sensible of the deep responsibility they assume who disregard the means to attain an end, and of all the danger of setting in motion an engine which exceeds human power to control. Then, shaking off a train of reflection, which he accounted a weakness in such a moment of triumph, he retraced his steps toward his tent, giving the order as he passed to make the signal that should arouse the army from its slumbers. The first tap of the French drums was echoed from the bosom of the fort, and presently the valley was filled with the strains of martial music, rising long, thrilling, and lively above the rattling accompaniment. The horns of the victors sounded merry and cheerful flourishes until the last laggard of the camp was at his post. But the instant the British fifes had blown their shrill signal, they became mute. In the meantime the day had dawned, and when the line of the French army was ready to receive its general, the rays of a brilliant sun were glancing along the glittering array. Then that success, which was already so well known, was officially announced. The favored band who were selected to guard the gates of the fort were detailed, and defiled before their chief. The signal of their approach was given, and all the usual preparations for a change of masters were ordered and executed, directly under the guns of the contested works. A very different scene presented itself within the lines of the Anglo-American army. As soon as the warning signal was given, it exhibited all the signs of a hurried and forced departure. The sullen soldiers shouldered their empty tubes and fell into their places, like men whose blood had been heated by the past contest, and who only desired the opportunity to revenge an indignity which was still wounding to their pride, concealed, as it was, under the observances of military etiquette. Women and children ran from place to place, some bearing the scanty remnants of their baggage, and others searching in the ranks for those countenances they looked up to for protection. Munro appeared among his silent troops, firm but dejected. It was evident that the unexpected blow had struck deep into his heart, though he struggled to sustain his misfortune with the port of a man. Duncan was touched at the quiet and impressive exhibition of his grief. He had discharged his own duty, and he now pressed to the side of the old man to know in what particular he might serve him.
"My daughters,"
was the brief but expressive reply.
Good heavens! Are not arrangements already made for their convenience?
"Today I am only a soldier, Major Hayward," said the veteran. "All that you see here claim alike to be my children."
Duncan had heard enough. Without losing one of those moments which had now become so precious, he flew toward the quarters of Munro in quest of the sisters. He found them on the threshold of the low edifice, already prepared to depart, and surrounded by a clamorous and weeping assemblage of their own sex, who had gathered about the place with a sort of instinctive consciousness that it was the point most likely to be protected. Though the cheeks of Cora were pale, and her countenance anxious, she had lost none of her firmness, but the eyes of Alice were inflamed, and betrayed how long and bitterly she had wept. They both, however, received the young man with undisguised pleasure, the former, for a novelty, being the first to speak.
"The fort is lost,"
she said with a melancholy smile,
"though our good name, I trust, remains." "'Tis brighter than ever. But, dearest Miss Munro, it is time to think less of others, and to make some provision for yourself. Military usage, pride, that pride on which you so much value yourself, demands that your father and I should for a little while continue with the troops. Then where to seek a proper protector for you against the confusion and chances of such a scene?"
"None is necessary," returned Cora. "Who will dare to injure or insult the daughter of such a father at a time like this?"
"I would not leave you alone,"
continued the youth, looking about him in a hurried manner,
"for the command of the best regiment in the pay of the king. Remember, our Alice is not gifted with all your firmness, and God only knows the terrors she might endure."
"You may be right,"
Cora replied, smiling again, but far more sadly than before.
"Listen. Chance has already sent us a friend when he is most needed."
Duncan did listen, and on the instant comprehended her meaning. The low and serious sounds of the sacred music, so well known to the eastern provinces, caught his ear, and instantly drew him to an apartment in an adjacent building, which had already been deserted by its customary tenants. There he found David pouring out his pious feelings through the only medium in which he ever indulged. Duncan waited until, by the cessation of the movement of the hand, he believed the strain was ended, when, by touching his shoulder, he drew the attention of the other to himself, and in a few words explained his wishes.
"Even so,"
replied the single-minded disciple of the King of Israel, when the young man had ended,
"I have found much that is comely and melodious in the maidens, and it is fitting that we who have consorted in so much peril should abide together in peace. I will attend them, when I have completed my morning praise, to which nothing is now wanting but the doxology. Wilt thou bear a part, friend? The metre is common,
and the tune Southwell."
Then extending the little volume, and giving the pitch of the air anew, with considerate attention, David recommenced and finished his strains, with a fixedness of manner that is not easy to interrupt. Heyward was fain to wait until the verse was ended, when, seeing David relieving himself from the spectacles, and replacing the book, he continued:
"It will be your duty to see that none dare approach the ladies with any rude intention, or to offer insult or to taunt at the misfortune of their brave father. In this task you will be seconded by the domestics of their household."
"Even so."
"It is possible that the Indians and stragglers of the enemy may intrude, in which case you will remind them of the terms of the capitulation, and threaten to report their conduct to Montcalm. A word will suffice."
"If not, I have that here which shall,"
returned David, exhibiting his book with an air in which meekness and confidence were singularly blended.
"Here are words which uttered, or rather thundered, with proper emphasis, and in measured time, shall quiet the most unruly temper. Why rage the heathen furiously?"
"Enough," said Heyward, interrupting the burst of his musical invocation.
"We understand each other. It is time that we should now assume our respective duties."
Gamut cheerfully assented, and together they sought the females. Cora received her new and somewhat extraordinary protector courteously, at least, and even the pallid features of Alice lighted again with some of their native archness, as she thanked Heyward for his care. Duncan took occasion to assure them he had done the best that circumstances permitted, and, as he believed, quite enough for the security of their feelings. Of danger there was none. He then spoke gladly of his intention to rejoin them the moment he had led the advance a few miles toward the Hudson, and immediately took his leave. By this time the signal for departure had been given, and the head of the English column was in motion. The sisters started at the sound, and glancing their eyes around, they saw the white uniforms of the French grenadiers, who had already taken possession of the gates of the fort. At that moment an enormous cloud seemed to pass suddenly above their heads, and looking upward, they discovered they stood beneath the wide folds of the standard of France.
"Let us go," said Cora. "This is no longer a fit place for the children of an English officer."
Alice clung to the arm of her sister, and together they left the parade, accompanied by the moving throng that surrounded them. As they passed the gates, the French officers, who had learned their rank, bowed often and low, forbearing, however, to intrude those attentions, which they saw, with peculiar tact, might not be agreeable. As every vehicle and each beast of burden was occupied by the sick and wounded, Cora had decided to endure the fatigues of a foot march, rather than interfere with their comforts. Indeed, many a maimed and feeble soldier was compelled to drag his exhausted limbs in the rear of the columns, for the want of the necessary means of conveyance in that wilderness. The whole, however, was in motion, the weak and wounded groaning and in suffering, their comrades silent and sullen, and the women and children in terror, they knew not of what. As the confused and timid throng left the protecting mounds of the fort, and issued on the open plain, the whole scene was at once presented to their eyes. At a little distance on the right, and somewhat in the rear, the French army stood to their arms, Montcalm having collected his party so soon as his guard had possession of the works. They were attentive but silent observers of the proceedings of the vanquished, failing in none of the stipulated military honors, and offering no taunt or insult in their success to the less fortunate foes. Living masses of the English, to the amount in the whole of near 3,000, were moving slowly across the plain, toward the common center, and gradually approached each other as they converged to the point of their march. A vista cut through the lofty trees, where the road to the Hudson entered the forest. Along the sweeping borders of the woods hung a dark cloud of savages, eyeing the passage of their enemies, and hovering at a distance, like vultures who are only kept from swooping on their prey by the presence and restraint of a superior army. A few had straggled among the conquered columns, where they stalked in sullen discontent, attentive though, as yet, passive observers of the moving multitude. The advance, with Hayward at its head, had already reached the defile, and was slowly disappearing when the attention of Cora was drawn to a collection of stragglers by the sounds of contention. A truant provincial was paying the forfeit of his disobedience by being plundered of those very effects which had caused him to desert his place in the ranks. The man was of powerful frame, and too avaricious to part with his goods without a struggle. Individuals from either party interfered, the one side to prevent, and the other to aid in the robbery. Voices grew loud and angry, and 100 savages appeared, as it were, by magic, where a dozen only had been seen a minute before. It was then that Cora saw the form of Magua, gliding among his countrymen, and speaking with his fatal and artful eloquence. The mass of women and children stopped, and hovered together like alarmed and fluttering birds. But the cupidity of the Indian was soon gratified, and the different bodies again moved slowly onward. The savages now fell back, and seemed content to let their enemies advance without further molestation. But as the female crowd approached them, the gaudy colors of a shawl attracted the eyes of a wild and untutored Huron. He advanced to seize it without the least hesitation. The woman, more in terror than through love of the ornament, wrapped her child in the coveted article, and folded both more closely to her bosom. Cora was in the act of speaking, with an intent to advise the woman to abandon the trifle, when the savage relinquished his hold on the shawl, and tore the screaming infant from her arms. Abandoning everything to the greedy grasp of those around her, the mother darted, with distraction of her mien, to reclaim her child. The Indian smiled grimly and extended one hand in sign of a willingness to exchange, while with the other he flourished the babe over his head, holding it by the feet, as if to enhance the value of the ransom. "Here, here, there, oh, everything!" exclaimed the breathless woman, tearing the lighter articles of dress from her person with ill-directed and trembling fingers. "Take all, but give me my babe!" The savage spurned the worthless rags, and perceiving that the shawl had already become a prize to another, his bantering but sullen smile changing to a gleam of ferocity, he dashed the head of the infant against a rock and cast its quivering remains to our very feet. For an instant the mother stood, like a statue of despair, looking wildly down at the unseemly object which had so lately nestled in her bosom and smiled in her face. And then she raised her eyes and countenance toward heaven, as if calling on God to curse the perpetrator of the foul deed. She was spared the sin of such a prayer, for, maddened at his disappointment, and excited at the sight of blood, the Huron mercifully drove his tomahawk into her own brain. The mother sank under the blow and fell, grasping at her child in death, with the same engrossing love that had caused her to cherish it when living. At that dangerous moment Magua placed his hands to his mouth and raised the fatal and appalling whoop. The scattered Indians started at the well-known cry, as coursers bound at the signal to quit the goal, and directly there arose such a yell along the plain and through the arches of the wood as seldom burst from human lips before. They who heard it listened with a curdling horror at the heart, little inferior to that dread which may be expected to attend the blast of the final summons. More than 2,000 raving savages broke from the forest at the signal, and threw themselves across the fatal plain with instinctive alacrity. We shall not dwell on the revolting horrors that succeeded. Death was everywhere, and in his most terrific and disgusting aspects. Resistance only seemed to inflame the murderers, who inflicted their furious blows long after their victims were beyond the power of their resentment. The flow of blood might be likened to the outbreaking of a torrent, and as the natives became heated and maddened by the sight, many among them even kneeled to the earth and drank freely, exultingly, hellishly of the crimson tide. The trained bodies of the troops threw themselves quickly into solid masses, endeavoring to awe their assailants by the imposing appearance of a military front. The experiment in some measure succeeded, though far too many suffered their unloaded muskets to be torn from their hands in the vain hope of appeasing the savages. In such a scene none had leisure to note the fleeting moments. It might have been 10 minutes. It seemed an age, that the sisters had stood riveted to one spot, horror-stricken and nearly hopeless. When the first blow was struck, their screaming companions had pressed upon them in a body, rendering flight impossible. And now that fear of death had scattered most, if not all, from around them, they saw no avenue open but such as conducted to the tomahawks of their foes. On every side arose shrieks, groans, exhortations, and curses. At this moment Alice caught a glimpse of the vast form of her father moving rapidly across the plain in the direction of the French army. He was in truth proceeding to Montcalm, fearless of any danger, to claim the tardy escort for which he had before conditioned. 50 glittering axes and barbed spears were offered unheeded at his life, but the savages respected his rank and calmness, even in their fury. The dangerous weapons were brushed aside by the still nervous arm of the veteran, or fell of themselves after menacing an act that it would seem no one had courage to perform. Fortunately, the vindictive Mockle was searching for his victim in the very band the veteran had just quitted. "Father, father, we are here!" shrieked Alice as he passed at no great distance, without appearing to heed them. "Come to us, father, or we die!" The cry was repeated, and in terms and tones that might have melted a heart of stone, but it was unanswered. Once, indeed, the old man appeared to catch the sound, for he paused and listened, but Alice had dropped senseless on the earth, and Cora had sunk at her side, hovering in untiring tenderness over her lifeless form. Munro shook his head in disappointment, and proceeded, bent on the high duty of his station. "Lady," said Gamut, who, helpless and useless as he was, had not yet dreamed of deserting his trust, "it is the jubilee of the devils, and this is not a meet place for Christians to tarry in. Let us up and fly." "Go," said Cora, still gazing at her unconscious sister. "Save thyself. To me thou canst not be of further use." David comprehended the unyielding character of her resolution by the single but expressive gesture that accompanied her words. He gazed for a moment at the dusky forms that were acting their hellish rites on every side of him, and his tall person grew more erect, while his chest heaved, and every feature swelled and seemed to speak with the power of the feelings by which he was governed. "If the Jewish boy might tame the spirit of Saul by the sound of his harp and the words of sacred song, it may not be amiss," he said, "to try the potency of music here." Then, raising his voice to its highest tone, he poured out a strain so powerful as to be heard even amid the din of that bloody field. More than one savage rushed toward them, thinking to rifle the unprotected sisters of their attire, and bear away their scalps. But when they found this strange and unmoved figure riveted to his post, they paused to listen. Astonishment soon changed to admiration, and they passed on to other and less courageous victims, openly expressing their satisfaction at the firmness with which the white warrior sang his death song. Encouraged and deluded by his success, David exerted all his power to extend what he believed so holy an influence. The unwonted sounds caught the ears of a distant savage, who flew raging from group to group, like one who, scorning to touch the vulgar herd, hunted for some victim more worthy of his renown. It was Magua, who uttered a yell of pleasure when he beheld his ancient prisoners again at his mercy. "Come," he said, laying his soiled hands on the dress of Cora. "The wigwam of the Huron is still open. Is it not better than this place?" "Away!" cried Cora, veiling her eyes from his revolting aspect. The Indian laughed tauntingly as he held up his reeking hand, and answered, "It is red, but it comes from white veins." "Monster! There is blood, oceans of blood upon thy soul. Thy spirit has moved this scene." "Magua is a great chief," returned the exulting savage. "Will the hair go to his tribe?" "Never. Strike if thou wilt, and complete thy revenge." He hesitated a moment, and then, catching the light and senseless form of Alice in his arms, the subtle Indian moved swiftly across the plain toward the woods. "Hold!" shrieked Cora, following wildly in on his footsteps. "Release the child wretch! What is it you do?" But Magua was deaf to her voice, or rather, he knew his power, and was determined to maintain it. "Stay, lady, stay!" called Gamut after the unconscious Cora. "The holy charm is beginning to be felt, and soon shalt thou see this horrid tumult stilled." Perceiving that, in his turn, he was unheeded, the faithful David followed the distracted sister, raising his voice again in sacred song, and sweeping the air to measure with his long arm, in diligent accompaniment. In this manner they traversed the plain through the flying and wounded of the dead. The fierce Huron was at any time sufficient for himself and the victim that he bore, though Cora would have fallen more than once under the blows of her savage enemies, but for the extraordinary being who stalked in her rear, and who now appeared to the astonished natives gifted with the protected spirit of madness. Magua, who knew how to avoid the more pressing dangers, and also to elude pursuit, entered the woods through a low ravine, where he quickly found the Narragansetts, which the travellers had abandoned so shortly before, awaiting his appearance in custody of a savage as fierce and malign in expression as himself. Laying Alice on one of the horses, he made a sign to Cora to mount the other. Notwithstanding the horror excited by the presence of her captor, there was a present relief of escaping from the bloody scene enacting on the plain, to which Cora could not be altogether insensible. She took her seat, and held forth her arms for her sister, with an air of entreaty and love that even the Huron could not deny. Placing Alice then on the same animal with Cora, he seized the bridle, and commenced his route by plunging deeper into the forest. David, perceiving that he was left alone, utterly disregarded as a subject too worthless even to destroy, threw his long limb across the saddle of the beast they had deserted, and made such progress in the pursuit as the difficulty of the path permitted. They soon began to ascend, but as the motion had a tendency to revive the dormant faculties of her sister, the attention of Cora was too much divided between the tenderest solicitude in her behalf and in listening to the cries which were still too audible on the plain, to note the direction which they journeyed. When, however, they gained the flattened surface of the mountain top, and approached the eastern precipice, she recognized the spot to which she had once before been led under the more friendly auspices of the scout. Here Magua suffered them to dismount, and notwithstanding their own captivity, the curiosity which seems inseparable from horror, induced them to gaze at the sickening sight below. The cruel work was still unchecked. On every side the captured were flying before their relentless persecutors, while the armed columns of the Christian king stood fast in an apathy which has never been explained, and which has left an immovable blot on the otherwise fair escutcheon of their leader. Nor was the sword of death stayed until cupidity got the mastery of revenge. Then, indeed, the shrieks of the wounded and the yells of their murderers grew less frequent, until finally the cries of horror were lost to their ear, or were drowned in the loud, long, and piercing whoops of the triumphant savages. Chapter 17.